So we are live. Okay, welcome everyone to the mentoring session. This is the mentoring session 1. It's about ethics in NLP. And in this session, we have 3 panelists which are joining us today. Dr. Luciana Benotti, Dr. Ted Pedersen, and Dr. Daisuke Kawahara. They will be introducing themselves in a few minutes, and then we will start the conversation about this very interesting topic in NLP. So now I will give the microphone to Luciana, so she can introduce herself, and she will talk us about a little bit about what she's doing. What are her research area and main research interests. Thank you, Luciana.
Well, thank you very much, Elena, and thanks everybody that is joining today for the panel, and thank you very much to this fantastic school that, as I was talking to some people on the Slack, is so diverse, and there's people from so many different countries. These few slides that I prepare is just to show some information about some upcoming events. I will briefly first introduce myself. So my area of expertise are dialogue and interactive systems in computational linguistics. And also I work on grounding language in vision. So I work in particular on dialogues that are situated either on a visual or on a physical environment, like dialogue integrated into a robot. And in particular, I investigate different kinds of grounding, like grounding in vision and grounding in collaboration, in dialogue between 2 people or multi-log between more than 2 people. So that's my area of research, but also I'm participating here today as a representative, so as a member of the executive board of the North American Association of Computational Linguistics. I was elected there, and I'm from Argentina. So this is a picture from Patagonia, where I grew up, and I wanted to, my motivation to be part of the NACO board, which represents all the people that work on NLP in the whole continent of the Americas, is to represent in particular Latin Americans and other languages other than English in NLP. There are different efforts that we've been making regarding this goal inside and outside the executive board. And 2 of these efforts are social events organized by the Latinx community at NACO, and also the KIPU initiative, that is an initiative to promote artificial intelligence in Latin America that started in 2019 in person in Uruguay, and also is going on with virtual events in 2020. So I invite all the people here to join these 2 communities, and I give some information here about these 2. So KIPU is currently holding an event every month online. They made this huge event in Uruguay in 2019 that got together a lot of people working on artificial intelligence, machine learning, and in particular computer vision, although there were some people from NLP too. And it was a very motivating event, and the people that attended there kind of feel sort of part of a community here. We had people from all over Latin America and people from Europe and from North America also giving talks. And in particular, next week, the following one, we are going to organize a seminar on fairness and biases on artificial intelligence, and we will have there a panel of discussion in this topic similar to the one we are holding today here, but also we will have a practical session there, a hands-on exercise on a Colab notebook, where we will observe in word embeddings different kinds of biases related to gender, race, and other social aspects. So I invite everybody to join that event. It's free and open to anybody that wants to attend. And in case, I will send the links, the relevant links into the Slack channel so everybody can join. I also wanted to talk a little bit about geographic distribution in the conferences that we have at AACL. In particular, I have here some statistics about the registrants at NACO 2021 that is going to happen next week. And here what I show are the people that registered in the different continents. For instance, we can see that if we consider only Canada and United States, we have 1,095 registrants. If we count Mexico and the rest of the countries from Latin America, we have 64 people that register. So there's a big imbalance between these people working, and in particular, there is a big imbalance of people working on English, in NLP, and on other languages, right? And if we look at the Americas, we see in particular that Spanish is a language that is not as developed as we all know as English here. So part of my efforts inside the board had been to promote the participation of more Latin Americans. And I was happy to see that in this NACO, there are many more Mexicans that are registering in comparison to, here I have the statistics for EMNLP 2020, where there were less than 10 people from Mexico registering, and in total 27 from Latin America. So these numbers are getting a bit higher, slowly but steadily, I hope, and I will. So I'm very interested in keeping these efforts so that things can improve also in the future regarding this. So these are some of the questions that we are going to discuss also. So the importance of geographic diversity in the different research areas, and in particular in NLP, that is our research area, whether that's important. That's something that we've been discussing in the different Latinx socials that we've organized in the different CL conferences that we participated. And in particular, also, we will be discussing there whether the fact that conferences are virtual is important for diversity. So for me, as you may have seen already by the things I'm talking about, diversity is the crucial point for ethics in NLP, but I will get more deeper into that during the panel. And finally, just to give you the link to the Latinx social that is going to happen at NACO 2020 next week. And also, as I said on Slack, if someone here is interested in a fee waiver to participate at NACO next week, just contact me directly. And I shared my email on Slack for you to do that. So those are all the slides that I had prepared. And I will give the microphone to the next.
Thank you, Luciana, for these interesting slides and for your presentation. We will soon start the questions. So first, we will also like to know about Ted Pedersen. Who is Ted Pedersen? What are his research interests? So Ted, welcome. You can introduce yourself, please.
Well, thank you. I am very happy to be here, and I should say, I'm very sorry that we are not together in Mexico City. It is one of my very favorite places that I hope to return to sometime, and so perhaps we can meet another time in person. I am a computer science professor, and I do my research in natural language processing has mostly been about issues relating to semantics of one form or another. And currently, I focus most on identifying humor and also identifying hate speech, and with a particular focus on Islamophobia or anti-Muslim bias. And that certainly, that kind of work intersects in a lot of ways with considerations of ethics that we can talk about as we go along. I also happen to teach a class in ethics that is for all of our computer science majors. They all are required to take an ethics class or this ethics class. And so I teach ethics as well in a slightly broader context, not just NLP, but in computing and technology. And I think I would agree with Luciana's previous point, by the way, that I think that ethics is not just about the problems we work on, but the people we work with and how we form and constitute communities, who we include, who we exclude. And so I think that's also an important part of these conversations. So I think that's my introduction, and thank you again for having me here.
Thank you, Ted. So now we will like to know about Daisuke Kawahara. Professor Daisuke, can you please introduce yourself and tell us about your research area? Where are you from, and in which field of NLP are you working on right now?
Yeah, thank you. So can I share the screen?
Yes, you can share your screen.
And so, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Daisuke Kawahara from Waseda University, Japan. So this is the self-introduction slide. So I was working for NLP for maybe 20 years. And so I at Japanese, so I'm focused on the Japanese natural language processing. So the research interest center on knowledge acquisition, language resource construction, mainly for Japanese, and also web information analysis. And also, I want to talk about some issues on developing NLP applications. So first, there is a bias in generation or language models. So we have to make a classifier for the toxic language or immoral chatbots. And also, there is a region bias. So this is maybe geographic bias. And so this is a bias of social acceptability of AI systems. So this is the number of submissions to last year's ACO. So there are two nations, China and US. So there are over 1,000 submissions. And so this graph is very skewed. So maybe we have to do something about this. And also there is a bias in the availability of language resources. So most language resources are available only for English. And for this, so we have been developing Japanese resources. So these are the English resources. So for example, there is a Pendry Bank and WorldNet, Brown Corpus and Book Corpus, and Google Benchmark. So for these resources, we have been developing Japanese resources. So for example, we have been developing Kyoto University text corpus. This is annotated, syntactically annotated newspaper corpus, including the word segmentation, post post tags and dependency. And also we have been annotating the predicate time structures and relations between nouns and anaphora and dark reference. And also we have a Japanese WordNet. And also we have a balanced corpus of contemporary between Japanese. But they are just after 20 or 30 years later. And also we have been developing the Japanese version of datasets for language understanding. And so the final issue is about errors in NLP system outputs. So we need to show trustworthy or accuracy of the system in advance. And also it is better to show evidence of the outputs. And I think users finally interpret and judge the outputs. So this is just the example of the application. So this is the COVID-19 World Information Watcher. So we have been developing this kind of application. So we have been crawling the information about COVID-19 from all over the world. And so we first apply machine translation and classify these pages to these topics. And so we can see, we can get the summary of the status of the infection and also the medical information and so on. And also, so here we can see the disputable issues. But so this is automatically detected. So the users have to judge the output of these classifiers. So, so important point is that the systems can output some results, but humans or users must interpret the results. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Daisuke. So now we will give you some questions for you to answer. And we would like to know about what do you think when you heard the term ethics in NLP? What does this imply to you? And if every one of you can give us some examples of harmful biases in NLP and what are the potential risks of these biases that you have found in your careers or over this time that you are working in NLP. We will start with the same order. First Luciana, then Ted, and finally Daisuke. So if every one of you can give us your opinion about these questions that we are asking. You can start, Luciana. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So what does ethics mean to me? So also, as Ted mentioned, I also teach a course on ethics. In fact, it's for data scientists. So it's not only for people that work on NLP, but in particular, these are computer scientists, right? So something that we define in that course is that ethics is a social construction. So it has to be built in an agreement between a community in what means for some practice to be fair or to be just for that community. Even something that we are worried in that course is that a lot of the content that we find related to ethics in artificial intelligence in general and in NLP in particular is designed from a perspective from other countries. right? So ethics is a cultural construction, and then it can get transformed into laws when there is enough agreement. But the thing is that the ethics that we are trying to define in NLP in particular is very dependent from other cultures, right? That maybe we don't identify with some of the concepts that have been developed there. An example that I like to give in particular regarding to computer scientists that do not have maybe a strong background on NLP is an example of a system that is able to where people register to get the turns to get vaccinated, right? For instance, now for COVID. So suppose that you are a system developer and you have this, you have to implement this system. And you know, in different countries, I mean, we have different priorities to give turns for vaccination in countries where there are not enough vaccines for everybody. And these priorities are based on age, because we know that COVID is worse for people that are of an older age. And then they are based on the different kinds of health issues and so on. So now more related to maybe NLP and how the different surnames of the people that are in that list affect the order, is that when we have organized the list of turns according to these different priorities, we still have a lot of people that fall into the same bucket, right? Because they have the same age, they have the same diseases and so on. So suppose that we decide as developers to order them alphabetically, right? And so here, this might seem as a harmless decision, but it's affected by how the surnames of these people came to be. So for instance, if the system is going to be implemented in a region in Mexico, where there are a lot of surnames that are of Nahuatl origin, and then these surnames start with X and with letters in the end of the alphabet, like T or X, and these common letters that start Nahuatl surnames, then all the Nahuatl origin people will be left to have their shots in the end of the list. So, so we can see how this is discriminative and how this is a problem, an ethical problem. So then suppose we say, okay, let's order it in the inverse order, because we don't want to do that, and we want people from Nahuatl origin to come first. So suppose they do that, and then someone says, okay, we can use this same system now in Patagonia, where people from Mapuche origin live, and most surnames in Mapuche origin start with a C or with H. So now these people are left for the end. So it's so now if we do this inverse order, inverse alphabetical order, Mapuche people are left to have their shots later and are discriminated. So it's very important to have a perspective that is region dependent when we define different rules for ethics. It's not possible to define ethics for NLP for the whole world. So that's what ethics means to me. It means that we need to take into account the cultural diversities that are determined by different factors, that are determined by where you live, who were your ancestors, what's the language that you speak, and these different factors that affect who we are as humans.
Yes, very interesting example, Luciana. Thank you very much. Okay, now, Ted, can you give us your point of view about these questions?
Yes, I'm happy to. And so in my career in NLP began in the later years of the last century, I guess is a way to put it. And at that time, I think it's fair to say that a lot of NLP was really just kind of a laboratory exercise that did not really connect much with the world. There are exceptions to that. But what's changed in that time, and let's say the last 20, 25 years or so, is that NLP now has an extraordinary reach into the world where it affects real people, where people use it every day, sometimes without even being aware that they are using NLP. And in many ways, this is a really good thing. It shows that the ideas and the technologies that we've developed are having an impact in the world. And I think everybody who goes into science and research often wants to have this kind of impact. But then with that, I think goes great responsibility. That people are using this in their daily life. They are not experts in how this works. They are trusting of the information and representations they receive. And so for me, ethics in NLP really has to do with thinking very carefully and very deeply about who is being impacted by these technologies in the world, and who is being impacted for the better, who is being impacted for the worse, and then who is being left out. And this gets to the issue perhaps of language representation and regional representation and so forth. And so we have an arsenal of tools available for us in English, for example, and in many languages we do not. And these are important issues for us to think about. And so I think the challenge, I think, is that for many of us who go into science and technology, we in some ways are more drawn to the algorithms, to the science, to the math, and we don't necessarily think or imagine that these things are really out in the world affecting people. And we don't necessarily think that we are the ones that should wrestle with these questions, that this is someone else's problem. And I guess my message and what I have learned is that we have to be a part of those conversations about the appropriate use of technology and NLP and so forth, because we are the ones who actually understand how it works. And so we have a kind of invaluable perspective. A kind of problem or an area where we see ethical challenges arise, and I think we've all maybe seen examples of this. If we think about large language models or just language models of any size, these are trained on text that we find in the wild, in news articles, Wikipedia, blog posts, and so forth. And we can do all kinds of amazing things with them, including starting text and letting the language model finish it. And one of the kinds of issues that we see is that for certain groups of people, certain kinds of people, the content that these models generate is really very toxic. It's really very hateful. And this connects a little bit to, not a little bit, quite a bit, to some of the work with Islamophobia, in that there are many negative representations of Muslims in written text that language models tend to build on and amplify even. And I think that's a very challenging problem to address. But certainly as end users are just maybe subscribing to the use of a language model, wanting to use it for maybe some kind of autocomplete tool in their business, or their chatbots, they're potentially unaware of the potential for this kind of content to be generated. They wouldn't necessarily imagine that's a possibility. And so I think our role is, as we're developing these technologies, is to first make it very clear what these limitations are, and then to the extent that we can, try to avoid creating content or generating content that's going to be harmful to people and the representation of different groups of people. So those are some of the things that I think about when I think about ethics and the kinds of problems that that we face there. So thank you.
Thank you, Ted. So yes, we are already having some questions from the audience, but we will first finish this first round with Dr. Daisuke. So, Professor Daisuke, can you share us about your experience with the topic, especially what do you think about when you heard the term ethics in NLP?
Yeah. So first, ethics for me is that people need to understand the risks of NLP and AI systems. So there are, of course, biases and also errors in NLP and AI systems. And so these are the potential risks. So, so we have been developing many applications. And so these applications should be in the society. So people can use these applications. And maybe these applications are useful for people. And so when we make these applications in the society, we need to explain their risks and their errors. And also, so it's better to make systems themselves explain their results. So this is explainability research, but it is still very difficult. So so we need to explain the potential risks to people. So this is the most important point, I think. So, thank you.
Thank you, Daisuke. We have some questions now. Luciana said that we cannot establish rules for the whole world, ethical rules in NLP, and that they depend on geography and culture. And this has generated some controversy. We have a question from Christian saying, would you agree that there are some underlying ethic values that can be taken as universal?
Yeah, it's good to have controversy in ethics. So I think, I mean, as humans, if we had enough representation of different cultures and we got together and we discussed, we could agree on some basic principles like not killing people, right? But the thing is that we cannot assume that from our single perspective, we can come up with these general rules for all the world. So we need, my point is that we need sitting at the table people from different perspectives so that they can explain to us how their culture or how their minority is affected by these controversies. For instance, there is the topic about autonomous weapons that are guided by artificial intelligence and whether it makes sense for these weapons to exist or not. And there is the position of the people that are part of the military system that is sending these weapons. And some people argue that it's a way of preserving their lives, right? Because they don't have to expose their own bodies to these words. So there's always different perspectives on problems, and we may think that autonomous weapons are bad, but some people may think that there are some reasons why they are not bad for them. Then it's a matter of, I mean, it's a very complex social issue to discuss the things, but my point is that we need to start hearing different perspectives, and that the NLP area, and particularly the NLP research area, nowadays is very is organized, and it's is powered by some cultures and not by other cultures right now. And we can see that very easily in which are the languages that are more evolved in NLP in particular.
Thank you.
Something,
okay, go.
just one example that maybe is illustrative for that we can see a problem in different cultures is from my area of dialogue systems, that also Ted mentioned issues with chatbots, is that when we move from discourse, so when we move from kind of news or Wikipedia into dialogue, we have the problem that dialogue is very contextually dependent, and then we have these contributions inside dialogue that are very anaphoric and elliptical to what was said before, right? So if we see in our data set an answer that is yes, just the simple harmless word yes, we may think that's no problem. I mean, it will never generate an ethical problem. But if the question that comes before that is, should I kill myself? And the answer that the system gives is yes. There we may agree in different languages and different cultures that that's raising some ethical problems.
Okay, thank you, Luciana. I don't know if Ted or Daisuke want to elaborate about that, or we go to another question. Okay, Ted.
Yes, it's a really interesting and important question, and it certainly comes up in conversations of ethics, like how do you find or define, is it possible to find a sort of universal set of standards? And I think the view that I take is that ethics and ethical thinking can maybe help us identify the assumptions that each of us is making as we talk about an issue. Are we valuing the collective well-being over individual well-being, for example? That's a very big issue in ethics. And I think if we can identify those kinds of assumptions, we will arrive at different conclusions, but we will at least have some understanding of what led us to that point. One exercise that I apply to myself and have done in classes and other kinds of conversations relies on this idea of the veil of ignorance, which is an idea from John Rawls, a Western philosopher. And the idea is you have a situation where there's some kind of ethical question to answer, and you imagine that you are placed behind a kind of veil of ignorance where you will be born into the world as one of the parties involved in this ethical dilemma, and that before you are born into the world, you need to agree to a set of rules and laws and principles that will govern how these situations are managed. And the idea is that if you accept the premise of that thought experiment and really think about the perspective of everyone potentially involved, you might arrive at an understanding or a set of principles that might be more agreed upon because everybody is kind of thinking outside of themselves and not necessarily thinking from their own perspective. It is hard to do this, though, and it's also hard. It's hard sometimes to imagine everyone who is involved in a particular situation. But I think ethics can give us tools to have those kinds of conversations and maybe explore those kinds of differences a little better.
Thank you, Ted. Any other word to close the topic? Okay, so now we have some hands, or at least one hand that is raised. Elena, can we give the talk, the word to Juan Vázquez?
I enable Juan so he can ask his question directly.
Yeah, hi everyone. I was wondering if NLP could be a way of accelerating the extinction of some languages, because this is a phenomenon that has been happening, of course, and now that the conversations and everything is moving towards the digital spaces, what's going to happen? I wonder what's going to happen with these languages that are not that don't have a lot of speakers or that don't have a lot of online presence. If that's like if you think that, of course, you can't predict the future, but if you think that this could be like an issue. Thanks.
Okay, Daisuke?
So I didn't understand the question. So the question is, the NLP techniques can accelerate
Maybe you
what?
can explain, Juan, a bit more?
Yeah, that some languages are not as developed in NLP as others, of course. And if this is in the future going to limit the applications of NLP for certain communities, and if that's going to exclude certain groups from the future technologies that are going to appear, and if you consider that this is an important issue.
So your question is, languages can limit the applicability of the systems.
Yeah, and how that could impact the lives of people who are linguistic minorities.
I see. So that's a very big problem. So the existing language resources are mainly for English. So maybe there are many Spanish resources, I think, but there are very few number of Japanese resources. So due to that, we cannot develop many applications. So that's a very big obstacle to develop NLP applications. So so we have to solve this problem. So the direct solution is just translate the English resources to the target languages, but it's not so good because there are many gaps between the languages. So we have to use the combination of techniques to make the language resources of the target languages. So anyway, so we need the language resources for each language. And recently there are many multilingual, for example, BART models, but it can be applied to the minority languages, but its accuracy is not so good. So so anyway, so we need the language resources for the each minority language. So thank you.
Thank you, Daisuke. Maybe Ted or Luciana want to say something else to complete? Luciana?
Yes. So I think that the question, as Daisuke said, the question that Juan asked is a very big one. And I think this is something that is not in the future, that is happening right now. So I I think that someone mentioned, I briefly read a question in the Q&A that companies are now filtering like hate speech, like for instance, Facebook and so on. And this is being done better. So as Daisuke was saying, the accuracy is better in languages such as English, in which there are more NLP resources. And then in other minority languages, the hate speech and also the fake news filtering is worse. The performance is much, much worse. In particular, there was one keynote that Timnit Gebru gave at one of the big AI conferences, I don't remember which one right now, where she was saying that the performance of fake news filtering for different Ethiopian languages during some conflicts, during the conflicts that they've had recently, the performance was horrible. So this is a problem that we are already having right now. That's my take on this.
Thank you, Luciana. Ted?
Yes, it is a very interesting question, and I think, you know, we are really at the beginnings of a time and an era where there is so much language technology in the hands of ordinary people around the world. And there's a big question, I think, is that going to tend to amplify and solidify the position of the majority languages and drive out the minority languages or the endangered languages? Or does that become a tool for enriching the endangered language community of users? And I don't know which way that goes. I can see arguments in both directions. This is sort of what you do in ethics, I guess, in that if you have dominant tools and platforms that are essentially promoting the use of English, let's say, particularly if they're very popular with young people, it may be that in a young person's day-to-day sort of social life or entertainment or you know, whatever they're doing online, that they gravitate towards a minority language and away from a minority language. On the other hand, it could also become a way for these smaller communities of endangered language speakers to connect with each other and to realize that their language is still alive and vital, and so could potentially energize that. And you know, I mean, the fate of endangered languages it's a relatively sobering story. If you look at, you know, Native American languages in the United States, for example, they are fading very rapidly. Young people are not typically learning them, even people born, you know, in those communities with native speakers around them. You know, I guess I'm not totally optimistic, but I can, you know, imagine that some of these technologies might tend to revitalize some of these languages. But I do think it's a very serious issue to think about, particularly as we deploy things into the world.
Thank you for your answers. This is a very interesting topic that it would be very interesting to develop more, but now we have other questions. One of them coming from Cyprian. He says, Facebook still has human monitors, and it's known how difficult such jobs can be. On offensive content detection, do you think we will be able to reduce the need of human monitors? I don't know who wants to say something about that. Ted, I don't know if you would like to.
Yes, I would. I think one of the things that is is not as well understood as it should be, even by people in NLP and technology, is the extent to which human beings are still in the loop on kind of behind the scenes making these technologies work. And content moderation is a great example. There are many, many people doing that work, and it is difficult, awful, I think emotionally damaging work. And there's a very serious ethical question for us, to consider there, that by deploying and having these systems in the world, we are in effect asking people to do this kind of work, 8 hours a day, day after day. And it's I think, fairly grueling. And so certainly there are reasons to try and reduce the human in the loop in these kinds of systems. But the problem itself is the technology is not to the point where we can do that. It's so fast moving. How offensive content and hate and violent extremist kind of content is expressed is constantly evolving, and so it's very difficult to do that. But it's important, and I think this is an example, kind of this veil of ignorance example, as we think about the world and imagine a world of users and NLP researchers, and content moderators, and all the other people that are involved in like making social media happen. What would we want if we were to find ourselves, for example, working as a content moderator? What would our expectation be of that company and what they were asking us to do? So at least in the near term, I think it is important to think more deeply about the toll that kind of work takes on humans, and take very strong steps to try and improve that. And it won't be automation eliminating the need for that kind of work immediately, but it can certainly be made better than it is now, I think.
Thank you, Ted. Luciana, Daisuke?
Yeah, I completely agree with Ted that the work that is, many of the work of content moderation is done by crowd workers, and crowd workers are currently one of the lowest paid kind of work that you can find. So, as we recognize that this is a work that is so hard for people to perform manually, there are some efforts towards building communities of crowd workers so that they can support each other, also in trying to get some tasks that are better paid, how to organize their time better. There are also even companies that have the final decision on whether they pay or not for the work after they do a quality check. So this is also, again, people behind these technologies. So their input is used later to train this algorithm that try to detect hate speech automatically, but their work conditions are not good enough so that we can get good enough data for training these systems. So that's kind of a problem that goes in circles, for me, the labor conditions of these people have to improve so that our data for training algorithms can improve. And then also it's been shown that if annotators of hate speech are given more context about the hate speech they are annotating, they can annotate it better. For instance, there was this study on how annotators rated language coming from African American people as more toxic than language coming from other communities. And in fact, it was not considered toxic by annotators when they knew that these phrases were coming from African American, because they included words like that are considered offensive by other cultures, but not by this culture. So it's important that these people doing the work, when they are building the data, they have access to contextual information, so that the data that we get to train our algorithms is better annotated. Yeah.
Thank you, Luciana. I don't know if Daisuke wants to add something to these reflections.
I agree with Luciana. So it's very important to collaboration between the human and machines. So it's possible to make a kind of crash barrier to reduce the need of the human monitors. But in the future, we still need human monitors, or so it's important to combine the human annotations and also the machine technologies. So yeah, that's
it. Thank you. So we go to another question. This one comes from Alejandro. He says, when we train some system, it could take some bias from the training corpus, but selecting our training inputs in order to make them polite could modify our goal. How should we act in order to maintain some balance between a representative corpus and a polite corpus? Maybe Luciana wants.
Yeah, I already sent a link on the Slack before, I think it was 2 days ago, that there is this big project that is called, in fact, Big Science Project, that they are, that it's a big community of researchers. I mean, I'm one of the 500 researchers that registered for that. They are researchers from all over the world trying to answer among the questions exactly these questions. So how can we select a balanced data set to train a large language model, and other questions like how can we lower the impact, like the carbon footprint of these models and so on. But the question that was asked here is one of the main questions. So they are searching for representation of different languages and different communities, different dialects, and also how to curate these data sets so that they contain less biases than the ones that we've seen implemented in other large language models. So if you are interested in this effort, they are actively, so this group of researchers are actively looking for people to participate in these discussions. They've organized working groups, and that's going to happen. It started last month and it's going to happen for a whole year. With meetings, and anybody can contribute. So that's a big problem. So it's an important question, and it's one in which we can all contribute from our perspectives. Yeah.
Thank you, Luciana. As you said, science reflects our society, and it's difficult to change our NLP, our language models, if we don't change the society. I don't know if Ted or Daisuke want to add something to these reflections, to these thoughts.
I guess I can add a little bit, perhaps. I think this is a real important question, this issue of our training data, and how do we create it? Do we try and clean it in some way? Do we try and filter it? And I think it's, sometimes you'll see or hear, that a corpus is collected, and then a regular expression is applied to remove offensive words. And this is almost always problematic because, as we all know, the meaning of a word depends on its context. And so a word that is offensive in one context, that same word may not be offensive in another. And if you're just using a regular expression to kind of strip out, sentences or paragraphs that contain certain words, you are going to remove both offensive and ordinary content. And this can lead to a kind of unintended, I think, but it doesn't clean the data at all. It, in fact, maybe stigmatizes communities that maybe use words that are maybe generally considered offensive, but not when used in certain contexts, particularly in certain kind of in-group communities and so forth. And so, so I think if we if we are using a corpus that has been created by someone else, we need to look very carefully at how it was created and what kind of choices they made, and interrogate those quite seriously. Did they do any filtering at all, or did they just grab a bunch of text from wherever? And both of those can be potentially problematic, but we should know as much as we can about this data we're using. And if we don't know, if it's just like some stuff we download, we have to think really carefully about whether or not we should even use that. And so I think as we're creating corpora, collecting it, annotating it, filtering it, whatever we're doing to it, I think it's real important to carefully describe that so that we think seriously about that, and that others who may come along and use that data are aware of the decisions that we made. Because as we all know, I mean, I think all of us have probably downloaded and used various word embeddings. There's, glove embeddings and so forth that you just download and you use. When you did that, especially for the first time, how closely did you look at how those embeddings were created? What kind of data were they created from? What period of time, was that text written in, and for what audience, what context? Did you look at that, or did you just grab the embeddings and go? And I will say for myself that I just grabbed the embeddings and ran with them. I did stop myself and began to look at these questions, but it's very easy. One of the great things now is we have a lot of very easy to use NLP tools out there, and you really can just grab them and run. Unfortunately, that can lead to problematic data being propagated pretty widely. And so I think it's important for us who know about these things in particular to be very particular in how we describe the data we're creating or using, to hopefully slow that down a little bit.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you, Ted.
Go, Elena.
Okay. Daisuke, do you want to add something else about this topic?
Yeah, a little bit. So it's totally difficult to delete such toxic language in the training corpus. So it is important to understand the system might generate a kind of implied utterances in the case of chatbot. So, and also humans have created the training corpus for language models. So they basically essentially contain the implied or toxic language. So it is not possible to completely delete such noise. So that's a very big problem. So that's not the answer.
Thank you, Daisuke. Yes, during this summer school, we have been seeing how word embeddings contain bias from the corpus where they are training on. For example, Radha yesterday showed us some gender bias in the words that are more related to men or to women. There are a lot of research in this gender bias, religion bias, and other bias where the embeddings contain the word embeddings, the pre-trained, like Ted Pedersen said, the pre-trained word embeddings contain the information where they were trained on. Do you think that instead of modifying the training corpus, can we include some techniques in the algorithms so they do not learn these biases that are contained in the corpus? I don't know, maybe this can be a solution. What do you think about this? I don't know who wants to start, Luciana?
Yes, so there are some algorithms techniques for mitigating bias, in particular in word embeddings. For instance, the Kipu practical session that I mentioned that we are going to have on June 14, in which we have this workshop where we will interactively show a notebook. There we will be showing, as Radha did in the keynote, some biases related to gender and race and associated to different kinds of professions that people have, and how in particular, if we say, for instance, firefighter, that is a profession that is prototypically associated to male, and we select other professions that we think should be gender neutral, we can use, we will present their techniques for removing the bias towards one gender or another gender. That can be done without changing the training data. So that's something that is possible. Also, in the late research in NLP, it's like we focus mainly on changing on developing this kind of techniques, more algorithmic techniques, keeping the data fixed. Right now, there is kind of a wave in which people are talking more about changing the data and not only thinking about how to modify our models with algorithmic techniques. In particular, there is one paper that is going to be presented in ACL 2021 by Anna Rogers that is called Changing the World by Changing the Data, where she discusses that in industry, this practice of curating the data sets, like eliminating, as was suggested in this question, things that are biased, is something that is done routinely all the time. Like curating data sets is important, and in research there is not. In research in NLP in the late years, there's not have been so much research on curating. And this paper is more kind of an open call for the research community to start focusing not only on algorithmic solutions, but also on more systematic ways of curating the data. Yeah.
Thank you, Luciana. Ted, do you want to add something to this question?
Sure. I think it's another very hard problem, and it's good. It's good that we have hard problems, and I think with bias mitigation, I think we can certainly, for those cases we know about, we can do things. The problem, in my view, is that there are often other biases reflected in the text that we may not be aware of. We're not sensitive to, perhaps they're biases against a particular group of people that we're not terribly familiar with, and we don't even understand what's being said that would be offensive to a person in this group, and or reflect an attitude about them that we're just not conscious of. And so I think it, to some extent at least, it seems to me that sometimes with bias mitigation, you sort of need to be aware of the biases that you are seeking to mitigate. And then there's a danger that you carry that out on a data set, and it's then perceived to be kind of clean and safe to use, and so others go along and use the data, and there are in fact other biases that are present and that have not been mitigated for or corrected. And I think it sometimes feels to me like almost like an endless cycle. We can keep digging and finding more and more different kinds of biases. Another side to the question too is that, as was mentioned by one of our moderators, I believe, that these texts do reflect society, and there is knowledge about society contained even in these hateful, biased texts sometimes. And if depending on what our motives are, it may be worthwhile to study maybe the progression of a bias against a particular group of people or a gender and so forth. And so, if the goal is always to mitigate or remove that, we may lose a kind of valuable window on maybe some of the uglier aspects of human existence, which are still important to study. And so I think there's a lot to talk about and think about there as we move in these directions, particularly kind of the unintended harms that may come if we remove one kind of bias but leave in others that people may not be aware of.
Thank you, Ted. Daisuke, would you like to add something to this question?
Yes. So we can mitigate the biases in embeddings using some techniques, but so we need to reduce such biases, but it's not, again, it's not possible to totally delete the biases in the embeddings or also AI systems. So so originally human activities are biased, so we have biased corpus. So I think we live with these biases. So ultimately, we need to permit AI systems with bias to some extent.
Thank you, Daisuke. We have two last questions. No, we still have time. So we have two questions that are a little bit related. So one of them is, what's your take on the intersection of hate speech and free speech when working on hate speech? And also, if you know if there is any work done to minimize the bias found in the annotators. I think this one is for Ted, that he is the one working on hate speech. So Ted, would you like to answer this question?
Sure, I can certainly start. I think all of the panelists, I think, probably have some views on this, but yes, the question of hate speech versus free speech, I think, is an example of where we do get into these kind of questions of cultural expectations, and also differences in ethical and legal systems. And so, you know, there's an ethical view of what free speech constitutes. There's an ethical view of what hate speech constitutes. There's also a legal view of what free speech is and what hate speech is. And the two dimensions, the ethical and the legal definitions, do not necessarily intersect. In fact, they usually don't. And this adds to the challenge. Some countries, their legal system will define any statement against the ruler as essentially, you know, like some kind of hate speech or you know, insurrection or something like that. Whereas another country, that may not be a problem at all. And so, you know, navigating this has to do with both navigating the legal and the ethical systems that we're following. I think there is, in the United States, is a kind of particular case where neither hate speech nor free speech is really clearly defined in law. And this is why it's often a very contentious discussion in the United States. There's, you know, kind of legal precedents set by, you know, that in terms of defining free speech, that, well, free speech does not include, for example, shouting fire in a crowded theater. You do not have a right to do that. Now, there's not necessarily a law or constitutional amendment that says that, but that kind of standard has been defined through legal precedent. And other nations have much more clear legal guidance, at least on what hate speech is, for example, or what is prohibited speech. And I won't speak for other countries. That's risky, but I know that some countries have a much clearer legal definition of what is prohibited or hate speech. But then, is that ethical? It's very dependent on the circumstances. So that was kind of a rambly start. I see the related part of the question is minimizing the bias found in the annotators. And I do think that's an important part of this. I think an annotator, either a crowd worker or a student or whoever who is doing annotations, needs to have a pretty good understanding of the context in which hate speech may be occurring in order to identify it. And if they don't, they will very likely produce or replicate biases in their annotations, where they're not aware of the cultural circumstances of certain kinds of hate speech, and may simply accept one side in those conversations as being correct, and essentially label anything in opposition to the government, let's say, as hate speech or something. And so I think careful work with annotators and educating them and supervising them can help produce maybe a more neutral kind of annotation. So, but that's just a start. There's a lot more to say, I am sure. So I will turn this over.
Yes, thank you, Ted. Yes, I agree with you. I don't know. We have panelists from very different parts of the world. We have North America, South America, and also Asia. So, Daisuke, do you have any opinion about this question? Can you share with us your opinion, please?
Yes. So this is a very essential question about any annotation tasks. So so I don't have any experience about the hate speech annotation, but so I have experience of the annotations for linguistic structure and so on. So the common approach is to take inter-annotate agreements, so we can modify the guideline and then take the agreement. So we can iterate this process. And also in the case of using crowdsourcing, so we can employ multiple workers. And so if we employ more and more workers, so we can reduce the biases in the annotations. So if the task is a very subjective task, so in that case, we should employ more workers. And so in that case, so we can make accurate the subjective annotations. And also we can minimize the bias in the annotators. So that's one approach. Yeah.
Thank you. So let me summarize. That says that we can educate our annotators in the case we don't have enough annotators, like Daisuke said. We can have more annotators, so we will have different point of view, and then we will hopefully get an agreement that will be enough for these kind of annotations. So we have so far we have 2 point of view. When we have few annotators, try to educate them. When we don't have, we have the ability or the capacity to have more annotators, maybe when we have more point of view, we can have an agreement that will be better for eliminating the bias in the annotation. So now Luciana will give us also her point of view about this topic.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Ted and Daisuke in the complementary perspectives that they've given. One question I would like to raise regarding this is when we think about like educating our annotators or having diversity of annotators. So who are our annotators, and how are we educating them? So something that concerns me is that the filtering of hate speech right now is in the hands of multinational companies like Facebook and Google. And I think that all the countries need to have a discussion of whether this is all the society in different levels need to have a discussion on whether this is what we want, this is what we consider appropriate. Some countries argue that governments should be in charge of filtering hate speech, but that's also risky, as Ted argued that, for instance, in the United States, that's something that is maybe not socially acceptable. And but we've seen during some of the recent political events in the US that these companies have a lot of power, like to close the accounts of important politicians in the countries and silence them. And I think this raises several ethical issues, even if we are in favor or against these politicians. This raises important issues about free speech. So who is going to moderate the large amount of content that we are producing and all the hate speech is a big question for our generation. So is it the companies that they are doing it right now? Is it the governments that have to be done? Is it possible that we don't do it? I mean, that's something that we also don't want, I guess, to have the free hate speech everywhere. So it's a big question for our generation, I think. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Luciana. Yes, this is a big question because nowadays the information is everywhere. You can access what someone says miles away from you, and this can impact anywhere. No? So we have about 5 or 10 minutes before closing our session. So I would like to left the question by Fernando Sanchez at last. We have another question by Christian Maldonado. This is very interesting. He says, I was discussing with a linguist recently whether standardization of the orthographies or of minority languages is a prerequisite for preservation. I think for inclusion purposes, developing means of understanding disparate orthographies is more respectful and will generate less friction. Can anybody wait on this topic? So maybe we can have a brief discussion of this. I think it's interesting. So I don't know if Luciana, you want to start?
Yes. So in my personal opinion, I mean, I think that it would be more respectful, as suggested here by Christian, to respect different orthographies, because these are different languages, right? I mean, these are different languages that have evolved, and I don't believe in the notion of dialect. So for I don't know if you've heard that kind of joke by linguists that what's the difference between a dialect and a language, and it's just that the people that speak a language have an army, so it's a matter of power, and so I think that these are different languages that have evolved with different orthographies, and why should we force people that have all their lives written something in a particular way to change that? And in which direction should we change? Should we change? Usually it changes in the direction of the people that have more power. That's the orthography that we use. So I think that NLP has the ability, the technologies of NLP have the ability to be able to respect these different orthographies and be able to match from one to the other so that people don't have to adapt themselves. And that work is very interesting.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Luciana, for your intervention. Daisuke, would you like to add something about this topic, about language standardization?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. So I think to standardize languages, so we need communication, and also we need to understand the different culture in different languages. So understanding that communication is a very important point to the 4Ps. So essentially we want to communicate with other people using the language technology. So it's a very important point.
Thank you, Daisuke. Ted, would you like to add something?
I think just very briefly, you know, having respect for the orthography and other aspects of any language is important, and I would argue it's ethical. I mean, to you know, not to expect a language to be written in the Roman alphabet just because. And so I think it's an important question both for language preservation and also just sort of the ethical conduct of NLP. If you're creating a tool or an app in a language and you're saying, well, we're going to make you transliterate everything, you know, into the Roman alphabet, you know, think about that. Is that really necessary? Is that a good thing? Is there another way to do this?
Thank you, Ted. I would also like to add something to this question. This touches me because I am from a country where we have two official languages, which are Spanish and Guarani. So when back in the 90s, when the government decided to make Guarani an official languages, they started this process of standardization, as Christian said. I think this was very helpful for all the country can join together and to speak this indigenous language. So nowadays, these languages is teach in every primary school and secondary school. I don't know how you say. So this is very. I think standardization is a good thing for in order to preserve indigenous languages. But there is also the question about the respect to the people who speak these languages. I don't know if they how they felt in this during this process, and I don't know if I think they feel more included in the government politics now, because all the laws and all the signs and every, I don't know, television show has the subtitles in Guarani, and everything now is in Guarani, so they can understand and they can feel more included in with the rest of the population that doesn't speak Guarani or this thing. So this is my point of view about this topic. So I hope I can add something to this discussion also. So, Gemma, do you want to ask the last questions to close our session about ethics in NLP?
Yes, we have two more questions or topic that we want to tackle. The first one is a question from Fernando. He says, when you find an ethical issue in your research, what procedures do you follow or recommend to follow to incorporate various ethical points of view in the approach to the issue? We would like to have a brief answer to this question from each one of you to close this line.
Okay, maybe I can start. I have a very direct response. So during NACO, I was part of the ethics committee that was implemented for the first time in an AECL conference. We were reviewing papers from an ethical perspective and as guidelines for people that if they decided they could add an ethical statement describing the ethical impact of their work. There were a series of questions that are publicly available in the NACO website. I will send the link here. And the recommendation was for researchers to ask themselves all these questions and to reflect on them and to answer them and include the answers to the questions in the ethical statement in the papers. So here is the link. No, I sent a direct message. I will change that to everybody. Yeah, that's the link to the series of questions. Yeah, to ask.
Thank you.
I found that list useful, although there was a low reviewer agreement on which papers required an ethical review and which didn't. That had to be said. Yeah.
Okay. Ted?
Yes. So I think it's important first to assume that there probably are ethical issues in your work, and to be open to that possibility. It doesn't mean that it's bad research. It doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it is the nature of work dealing with language. There are lots and lots of places where we can run into ethical issues. I guess I'd suggest thinking about just a few things. One, and this relates a little bit to the annotation question and other questions, think about your own positionality. I think about this a lot. Positionality is who are we? And so in working on Islamophobia, I have to acknowledge that I was raised in a Christian tradition. I am not a Muslim, and I know a good deal about Islam, I would say, but I am not Muslim, and I have to acknowledge that. And it makes it important to seek out people who are and who have lived that life, and who are perhaps better positioned to understand the impact of certain kinds of statements. And it's important to acknowledge that, you know, that there is a rich variety of people and experience who are Muslim, and this will be true of any kind of group of people that you might be working with, but it's or not working with, but, you know, if you're studying language that somehow impacts them, include them. There's a saying, kind of nothing about us without us, which I think is a good rule of thumb. If you're working on, let's say, detecting cyberbullying or something of that sort, you know, can you include people who have been, you know, subjected to that in some way, to better inform your perspective. And then the last thing, that I would suggest thinking about is, you know, do consider the sort of power dynamics at play in the problem you're solving. Who's going to benefit from the solution that you may be proposing or creating? Who potentially could suffer? Who potentially could be left out? Who wants this done? Who doesn't want this done? You can anticipate sometimes these ethical issues earlier, and maybe make it easier to adjust and adapt before it, you know, is too far into the process to really do that. So those would be some things I'd be thinking about.
Thank you, Ted. Daisuke?
Yes. So each ethical issue is very different. It's case by case. So I also think it is very important to make a guideline. So this is very similar to make an annotation guideline for an NLP task annotation. So so it's important to make a good guideline for annotation and also the ethical issues. Yeah.
Thank you. So finally, we would like to talk about a question that Luciana posed at the beginning of the panel. And it's the following. Can we keep some conferences virtual after COVID? How is this related to ethics? And do you think this would increase the diversity in the participation? You want to say something about that?
I also would like to hear what Ted and Daisuke think about this. I will briefly say that I'm a bit worried about the returning of in-person conferences. I mean, in the sense that the people from Latin America that I know of that have started participating again in the communities will have a harder time going to these conferences, basically because they are too expensive for us. I mean, for our countries. So I do think that virtual conferences have increased the diversity. We are calculating some numbers. As I showed you at the beginning, we have more Latin Americans in this NACO that we had like 1 year ago. I mean, it takes time for communities to catch up and to get into some research topic. But efforts like this one, like the school that you've organized, are very, very important for this. So thank you for organizing this. In my personal opinion is that I would like to see some fully virtual conferences and not only hybrid ones every once in a while, so that we can all be first-class assistants to these conferences, and there are not two-class system assistants to hybrid conference. Having said this, I also think that hybrid conferences are a good compromise when so people that have a paper conference and they cannot attend, the remote participation should always be an option. That's also something that I believe in.
Okay, thank you, Luciana. I don't know if Ted or Daisuke want to add something to this.
I'd be happy to add a little bit. I think I truly hope that we continue with virtual conferences past the pandemic. I think the degree of inclusion that it has enabled has been, I think, to me, very inspiring, actually. I mean, I've attended various virtual events where I have met people who I know I would never see them at the in-person event because of cost, because of visa restrictions, maybe because of family situations that don't allow for travel. I mean, there are a lot of people around the world who are caregivers, who have many children, young children, have their own health problems and so forth. And they're pretty much, they're almost immediately excluded from in-person events. And so I do understand it's a new way of doing things. We've had about a year of this now, and I think it's gotten quite a bit better. But I would like to believe that as a community, we will have the will to continue to improve virtual events, to make them engaging and to make them valuable parts of the community, because I'll do my veil of ignorance experiment. It's an accident of fate that I happen to be born in the United States and, to a relatively, kind of upper middle class family, that I work at a university that pays me a reasonable amount of money that supports at least some of my travel. That is a pure accident. I could have easily been born in many other circumstances, many other countries where even, having these same interests, having the same abilities, I would not be able to attend these events because of the cost, because of the passport, because of the visa. And that's just wrong. I mean, there is no possible way that you can argue that that is ethical or good.
Thank you. Daisuke, would you like to add something?
I totally agree with Luciana and Ted. So we definitely keep the virtual conferences. So anyone in the world can attend the conferences. So that's the best form.
Thank you. Elena, would you like to close?
Yes. Well, we would like to thank Ted Pedersen, Luciana Benotti, and Daisuke Kawahara for this wonderful session. I think this was a very insightful session where we all learned a little bit about ethics, and also the participants are also thanking you for this session. We will hope to see you next year during some event, or during the year in the next NLP events that we have. We have in 2 weeks the Kipu, right? Kipu was the
Kipu in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks, and Knuckle next week. So I think we will see you there. Thank you very much. And well, I hope we can still have this, I don't know, maybe mixed virtual presence conferences next year. So we will see each other in person, hopefully. So and some notifications, we have I think in 2 minutes, the Bloomberg AI Career Stories in AI session. So you can join us on the main session if you want. You are all invited. And thank you very much again. And I hope to see you soon.